And now I would like to introduce today's special guest. Today we're going to talk about energy. And while Canada produces a lot of it in terms of oil, gas, and electricity, we consume a lot of it too. From a historical perspective, 1973 was a very important year for energy, as it was the year of the OPEC oil embargo. In 1973, oil importing nations woke up to the stark realization of their utter dependence on oil. The embargo created oil shortages that were felt around the world with profound negative effects, both economic and political. Since that time, we've become used to oil prices rising and falling for a variety of reasons tied to supply. But as expensive as it may be to fill your tank, there hasn't been a critical shortage to compare to that period 3 decades ago. Yet, the fact is that energy prices are still strongly affected by geopolitical factors, war in the Middle East, political uncertainty in South America, exposure to terrorism. More threatening, however, is the fact that traditional sources of oil and natural gas are quickly dwindling. And while Canada, the United States, and Mexico together produce 1/4 of global energy supply, we also consume 1/3 of that same supply. So what's to be done? To the south, the Bush administration has made a continental energy policy a priority. So has the government of Mexico. In our country, however, there is what has been described as a policy vacuum on energy. This brings me to today's guest. Ralph Klein recently stated that he had never heard anyone at any level of government across Canada articulate a compelling vision for this country's continental energy future. Well, he's not in government anymore, but I think we're going to hear something compelling today. Canadians have always counted on Ralph Klein for the frank assessment and the bold statement. His vision and firm judgment helped make Alberta an economic powerhouse in this country and the envy of the continent. In his 14 years as Premier, there was no stronger, more eloquent advocate of the prime importance of energy issues. Now, he, along with former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Brian Tobin, are overseeing the development of a continental energy strategy for Canada through the Fraser Institute Centre for Energy Policy Studies. Please join me in welcoming to our podium today the former Premier of Alberta and now a Senior Business Advisor with Borden Ladner Gervais and a Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, Ralph Klein, as he explores Canada's energy future and what we must do to secure it. Ralph.
Noella, thank you so very, very much. What a pleasure it is to be back at the Canadian Club here in Toronto. I think that this is my third time back here. I'm one better than Churchill, I think. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here, not as a politician, but as a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute, a senior business advisor for BLG. And I joined BLG because of, well, 3 reasons. First of all, they now boast about being the largest firm in Canada. But certainly it is a firm with international and national reach, and that appeals to me because I do a lot of things internationally. Secondly, it's a firm that encourages involvement in outside activities. Many of the lawyers are involved in various community activities and charitable activities, and that appeals to me. And thirdly, there are a lot of lawyers like Sean Weir, the managing director, who doesn't talk like a lawyer. Like they talk like normal people. And that appeals to me. Now, the topic I've been asked to address, although I would like to talk about myself and my political career, but I've been asked to talk about a continental energy policy. And this is something that I'm happy to work on through the Fraser Institute. And as Noella mentioned, I'm a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. I'm also involved. I really haven't retired. Okay, I digress just for a moment, because not only am I with BLG, I'm with the Fraser Institute, the Manning Center for Democracy, the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. That'll start in October. The University of Alberta, the Mount Royal College in Calgary, and about 4 or 5 boards. So that's enough, right, including Marsh, Canada. And I'm very, very happy to be on your board, well, on the advisory board anyway. I don't know what advice I can give, but I'll find out tomorrow when I will be tuned in to the world of insurance, right? But I can talk to you about energy and the need for a comprehensive energy policy. Now, I certainly talked about this a lot when I was the Premier. And I'm happy to do it through the Fraser Institute. As Noellen mentioned, my friend, now he's my friend, Brian Tobin, the former Premier of Newfoundland, is working with me on the continental energy policy. And while we are of different political stripes, he'll be offering tremendous insight into offshore activities. I know nothing about offshore activities. I know nothing about Terra Nova and Hibernia and some of the other projects of the Sable Island pipeline, other than they produce oil and gas. But it's a different process. Certainly different than the oil sands. I'm pleased to be here with Mike Harris as well, who's also a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute and is with a law firm. As a matter of fact, John Crosby said, Jesus. He said, you got Brian Tobin working for a law firm. You got Mike Harris working for a law firm. You got Ralph Klein working for a law firm. None of them are lawyers. Pretty soon they'll all be applying for their QCs. But it's never been done before, a continental energy policy. And the reason it needs to be done is quite simply to spur on discussion, to get politicians to react, particularly Canadian politicians, to react to the findings of the Fraser Institute. Now, the report will come out in 7 volumes, and they will be very similar to the volumes that were produced by a project that Mike Harris and Preston Manning worked on. And that dealt with, well, all things it takes to be Canadian. And the first volume will present an overview, why we need a continental energy policy. Then we will deal with more specific items. And I don't know at this point what order those specific items or the volumes will come out in. But I do know the first will present an overview. But we will deal, and I have suggested that the first thing that we should deal with after the overview is the security of supply. Now, just recently, my former government, because I'm no longer in politics, sent a fellow to Washington, D.C. to throw some water buckets. In other words, to make the legislators, the senators, and the Congress people to stand up and take notice. And they have. They have now recognized and have included in their inventory of known reserves the oil sands in northern Alberta. That represents 178 billion barrels of known reserves. That extrapolates into the potential to produce 3 to 5 million barrels per day. Now, why is it so important to the United States to look at security of supply? Well, first of all, in the Bush energy policy that was alluded to by Noella, the president has talked about seeking outside of the United States safe and secure supplies of oil and gas. And my suggestion is that they didn't need to look to Iraq or to Venezuela or to other countries that have political problems. They need to look no further north than the 49th parallel, and particularly to Alberta, to achieve that safe and secure supply. Now, although it's bitumen, the cost of extracting that bitumen, and you've got to understand bitumen, it comes out like molasses, and it needs a diluent, and it needs to be upgraded to what they call synthetic crude. But you have to understand that the cost of producing this is now viable, especially with the price of oil at where it is at today. So that is certainly security of supply fits into a continental energy or North American energy policy. The other thing that you might be interested in knowing is that a brochure has been prepared by the Alberta Department of Energy, which shows the immensity of the oil sands in terms of all the oil produced in North America, in Mexico, and in the United States. And the amount of oil that is produced through the tar sands outstrips all of the production of oil throughout the rest of continental North America. Other volumes will deal with issues of the environment. And you all know that greenhouse gases and the contribution to global warming fits in. But also on the other side of the equation is the whole issue of investor confidence and not changing the rules. And what is a reasonable environmental policy in order to achieve sustainability? We will also address the challenges of infrastructure, the challenges of supplies, the challenges of labor. But we'll also mention the steps being taken by governments across Canada, including the federal government, the temporary employment program, the nomination program that I talked about, that was talked about today, Gar, at a BLG briefing for a delegation from Saudi the institution of, in Alberta at least, of the Access to the Future Fund, a legislated requirement that $3 billion be invested in post-secondary educational institutions, primarily for trades training. The amount of infrastructure that will be required to free up isolated First Nations people so they can work at the oil sands. So a lot is being done. A lot more needs to be done. Then other volumes will deal with the issues of native claims, the rights to territorial and traditional hunting grounds. And this has become an issue not only in Alberta but throughout Canada. We'll deal with the issue of pipelines as well, including the Southern Route, the Alaska Pipeline, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, the problems with siting LNG, liquefied natural gas plants, the environmental problems. We'll talk about something that is very topical in Alberta, and perhaps it's topical here, and that is the whole issue of royalty and income trusts. And we'll talk about an integrated energy policy. And this will apply certainly to offshore facilities as well as to oil sands facilities. And by an integrated energy policy, I mean a policy to look at alternate forms of energy. In other words, to take that tremendous brain trust that has been built up in the towers of Edmonton and Calgary and St. John's, Newfoundland, in Nisku and Leduc, and yes, even here in Toronto, and use that tremendous brain power to look at alternate forms of energy. Coal. Now, I know it's wrong for any politician to talk about coal, but I like to talk about coal because I think that there's tremendous potential in coal, especially clean burning coal technologies. There's tremendous potential in coal bed methane, in coal gasification, in hydro, in wind, in solar, in nuclear power. All of these things should be taken into account in terms of the future and the future security of supply relative to energy. So as I mentioned at the outset, this is the very first time that we have been challenged with preparing a comprehensive continental energy policy. And hopefully, as I said at the outset, it will spur governments and the private sector on to action. That's all we hope to achieve from the report. And I thank you so very, very much. Now, I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have, Noella.
Okay. Well, you were very clear, Ralph. We only had 2 questions from the students. Mm-hmm. If the tar sands are now viable due to oil prices, why are the Americans still looking elsewhere for supply of oil? Okay,
the Americans consume 10 million barrels per day. In Canada, they get, or from Canada, they get about 19% of their oil and gas supply. They get another 13% from Saudi Arabia and other Mideast countries. So there still is a tremendous amount that they need, the U.S. And actually, Secretary Bodman, Samuel Bodman, who was visiting the oil sands last year, asked us if we could increase our production from 3 million barrels per day to 5 million barrels per day and to accelerate that production. I don't know if we can, given the challenges that I mentioned.
Thank you, Ralph. The USA continues to wage a very expensive war, and some say its economy is heading for big trouble. Shouldn't we be looking beyond the U.S. for energy partners in terms of who can pay for it in the longer term?
Well, this is precisely why we sent Murray Smith to Washington, D.C., to throw some water buckets and make the legislators there understand that they needn't be in Iraq. They needn't be in Venezuela. They needn't be in places of high political instability. That if they want a secure and reliable supply of oil and gas, they needn't look any further than north of the 49th parallel. And that is our message. That certainly is our message in Washington, D.C. And hopefully we will continue with that message. Murray is coming back sometime in the fall. But I hope that the new premier will replace Murray, because we need someone there in Washington who can throw, as I say, some water buckets. And by that, I mean, this is a political posting. This is not something for career diplomats in Washington, D.C. They are, well, they're like animals down there. And they eat you up and spit you out. And, you know, the reason I sent Murray down was not because of oil and gas. It was because of mad cow disease. And I do thank Toronto, because there was a concert here featuring the Rolling Stones. And the organizers of that concert were good enough to include the mad cow situation in Alberta and throughout Canada. So I decided we need someone to throw some water buckets in Washington to get them to understand the possibility of contracting that disease would be about 10 billion to 1. Well, a Stanford professor challenged me on that and said it's only 9 billion to 1. But in any event, it's very remote that you would get that disease. So that's one of the reasons I sent Murray down. The second reason, of course, was to convince the legislators of the security of supply that exists. I think that we've done a good job thus far. Certainly the administration is tuned in. I don't know if Al Gore is or not, but the administration certainly is.
Okay, Mike Harris pointed out that the true question was, should we be partnering with other countries other than the U.S.?
Should we be partnering? Well, I don't know if we need to partner. As I explained to the Saudis today, North America is unique. The only other countries we can partner with are the U.S. and Mexico and those in what they call Central America, and perhaps South America. But I don't know if we would want to partner with Venezuela, for instance. Maybe Peru, maybe Ecuador, because the Peruvians have indicated that they're interested in a free trade agreement with Canada. Maybe Chile, because This is a country that also has indicated that it is interested in a free trade agreement. So we need to search out the countries that we can partner with. But it's very, very difficult in shaping a continental or an international energy policy to include countries from offshore because the distances are just so far. The only other country that perhaps we can partner with, and again, they are looking for security of supply, and it's going to be a bit of an engineering feat to take a pipeline from Fort McMurray to Kitimat on the west coast and build a pipeline to ship raw bitumen so that the ships can pull in from China and take it over there to be processed. Now that is going to be a bit of an engineering challenge, to say the least, and it will probably take about 10 or 15 years to get off the ground. But that is the only other indication.
Thank you, Ram. What is the balance between increased production and saving the oil for Canada's future?
Well, you can save the oil, and that's why I have said that we should be looking at an integrated energy policy. We should be using that tremendous brain trust that has been built up to secure alternate forms of energy for when the oil and gas runs out. So we should be focusing on, well, I know in Ontario, and you know, I'm not going to say anything bad against your premier. I would never say anything bad against your former premier. But I know that he doesn't like coal. But I do like coal. We have about a 700-year supply. So rather than abandoning coal, look at clean burning coal technologies to reduce CO2 and capture the CO2 and re-inject it to stimulate oil. So I'm saying that there are all kinds of people, PhDs and lawyers and geophysicists and geologists and petroleum engineers and smart people and MBAs and you know, there's a wealth of them. Now is the time to turn that brain trust and that energy into looking at those alternate forms of energy to secure an energy supply for the future.
Thank you. Is the rising Canadian dollar as big a boon to Alberta oil companies as it is a bane to Ontario manufacturers?
Is it, you know, relative to imports and getting the equipment in for the oil sands, it is a boom. Relative to the export of oil, well, the price is so high now, I don't think it really makes any difference. I don't think that the impact is as serious in Alberta as it is here in Ontario.
Thank you. What is your perspective on the dispute brewing between the eastern provinces and the federal government on resource revenues and equalization payments?
Well, I've always contended we're a caring and sharing province, and we have no problems with the 10-province standard. We have no problems with including resource revenues, although Martha and Henry and Mr. and Mrs. Grundy, or the average Albertan, as I said, might have some problems because they experience the National Energy Program, not to be confused with the American NEP. back in the 80s, and they're saying, leave our resource revenue alone. So the problem is one of perception, and it's a political problem. But really it doesn't mean much to us.
Thank you. Well, the last question, because we're running out of time. How do you see your report affecting the work of the Business and Environmental Committee established by the Harper government?
I'm sorry?
How do you see your report affecting the work?
Well, certainly we will include issues of the environment in the report. The challenges facing the environment, the challenges relative to greenhouse gases. So that will all be included in the report. The issue relative to the environment and what the Harper report has brought down tries to achieve the same thing, and that is sustainability. In other words, you have to carry on the economy, you can't destroy investor confidence, and you have to protect the environment.
Well, thank you, Ralph. That was very gracious of you to take so many questions.
Well, thank you so very, very much, and thank you all. Again, you've been a great audience. Thank you.
That was very gracious of you, Ralph. You took a lot more questions than most of our politicians ever take. I would now like to call on Peter Klein, one of our board directors, to thank Ralph on our behalf.
As we approach another long, hot summer in Toronto, we're all reminded how important it is to have access to a reliable and firm energy policy. In his thoughtful, sobering, and challenging remarks today, Mr. Klein has underscored the scale and the importance for a consolidated North American solution. Much has been said about the USA's addiction to oil. It's a habit that all of us in North America share, and the reality is that it's an expensive one, and it's not a dependency we're going to shake anytime soon. Going forward, however, Canada as a nation and North America as a trading bloc, to remain competitive, we'll need to work together to use more effectively our current resources and plan more thoughtfully future energy requirements. As last week's G8 summit indicated, the energy file is not just a Toronto or Canadian issue, it's a global issue affecting our environment, our children, for generations to come. Thank you, Ralph Klein, for emphasizing that we need to work together closely to tackle this challenging issue.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks again to Ralph Klein for being with us today. Thank you all for coming today. This meeting is now adjourned.